investment in your life. Life Change Tea. Oh, and P.S. You'll lose some weight.
The Genesis Communications Radio Network proudly presents The Alex Jones Show, because there's a war on for your mind.
We normally go live at prisonplanet.tv during the third and fourth hour, but some days we do the whole show, simulcasting not just on radio, but on the internet streams at prisonplanet.tv. And I decided, why not go live with Alan Watt at prisonplanet.tv as well? So we just now went live. Alan, covering the globalist master plan to use carbon taxes to control and micromanage and tax every facet of life, our diets, what we do, inspectors in our homes, taxing beef, chicken, when it's grown, when it's raised, and then on your table. That's all being announced. They would deny this. Now they're announcing their world government. Break down what you were covering earlier in the last segment in more detail, and then let's get into, with your deep research of the globalist own research and documents, which I can vouch for. I've researched it all as well, but you've intently researched it with your perspective, where this is going and what we're going to see in the next few years, the time frame of the rollout. But recap in more detail what you were just covering in the last segment.
Yes, this is a script we're going through, a script that was written a long time ago, basically drawn up by the big foundations that bypassed democracy or any idea of democracy, and the ones who funded the NGOs and all the think tanks that they own and run. These think tanks are the ones that advise all governments on policy. And so when you look at them all, it's the same policy. It's one policy out of a whole bunch of think tanks that are all interconnected with the one globalist agenda. And all of these foundations and the Rockefellers and etc., they're all to do with eugenics, that they were always set up to do with eugenics, creating a new type of society, a reduced society, and actually going into the womb. I read something the other night from Tony Blair, an interview that he gave to a newspaper, on the fact that they were going to go into the womb and remove those genes, basically, that would cause someone to be violent or an extremist when they grew up.
And for those that don't know, in my film Endgame, we have the mainstream news articles out of England where 2-year-olds are put on probation with the police because of the, quote, genes of their parents. If their parents or grandparents ever committed a crime, they are now criminals at age 2. And they've talked about, in Oregon years ago, drugging babies in the womb if their parents are poor and show that they could be mentally ill. I'm not kidding. That's Prozac right. In the womb. Please continue.
Yes, and it's more than just that. It's also something that was discussed over 100 years ago at world meetings. And that was the necessity to identify those who could have leadership qualities down the road and go against their agenda and get the public to follow them. That's also part of this big screening process. They've done the same thing with the drugging of children, mainly young males in school, with the different drugs they give them, Ritalin, etc. These guys are generally very inquisitive. They ask lots of questions. They're diagnosed as being hyper because they ask questions, or they're not happy with the answers they get, and they generally have leadership abilities. So the agenda has never, ever faltered from how it was set down 100 years ago. They're right on track with this, and they're doing it, they're implementing it, and they hope to bring in a society, which I think is here now, to be honest with you, which will accept the changes over the next, up to the year 2050. That's their big target date for drastic population reduction. It's in all the big think tanks papers. It's in the military think tanks papers as well for Britain and the US. And they say there'll be a drastic reduction after the year 2050. The world they'll bring in, too, will also be a vegetarian world. That's on the cards. They say that the raising of livestock is just too labor-intensive and cost-intensive with carbon, etc. So they're going to eliminate meat for the masses, and you'll be left with the GMO foods. But population reduction is a big, big part of this, and eventually they hope to bring themselves through at the top. These wise ones that think that they're superior and believe it so, with a technocratic and scientific elite coming through with them, and just a few servants to basically supply their needs at the bottom. So this is their big agenda for their brave new world, and unfortunately, they're well on their way today. There's very little public opposition when you take the vast amounts of people in the world today. There's very few people who really care They have had work done on their minds since birth. They've had total indoctrination through the international educational system along the same path of sit back and enjoy yourself and don't complain about anything.
We're talking about neo-feudalism in the globalist own words. Speak about the final revolution, the scientific elite integrated with the central banks, as David Rockefeller said in the quote I read earlier, ruling over humanity, dumbing us down, domesticating us, fattening us up so we'd be weak, so that they could then get rid of our instinct for survival to then have an organized, soft kill operation. So let's get into the new man and getting rid of the old man, how from their own documents they plan to incrementally, through one-child policies, GMO foods, forced inoculations, reduce the world population by 80 to 90%.
Yes, it's even more insidious. They have done experiments. Arthur Koestler, who worked for MI5 and MI6 during the war, was also attached to think tanks in New York and experimental scientific laboratories for the United Nations, and he said that they'd already done experiments on lobotomizing that part of your brain which makes you, uniquely you. He called it the ghost in the machine. And he said there was different techniques. One of them was a delivery of chemicals to the brain via inoculation. It was very successful. And he also said, too, you won't need your survival capabilities because, again, the state will be making all your decisions for you.
And Bertrand Russell said the same thing. He said through diet, education, and other forms of brainwashing, that, and through injecting people, that humanity being able to rebel against their extermination would be as futile as sheep forming a rebellion against the practice of eating mutton.
No, that's right. So Russell and Koestler, all of these guys, and Russell and Koestler, by the way, both worked for MI5. That's in the open now.
It's now declassified.
It's declassified. So, and again, you have the Huxleys as well, who wrote about this in the 30s. Julian Huxley ended up running UNESCO, and he was quite open about the agenda of international education, which would in reality be an incredible scientific indoctrination, which would dumb the people down till they would accept anything. And they all were on track with the vast reduction of the population. And again, this brave new world where only the fittest would come through. They're all Darwinists, basically, and they do believe they're more evolved than the rest of the general public.
Absolutely. You know, when I've talked to globalists and people in the elite and their fellow travelers, they say, Alex, you're aware of all this. That means you should be one of us. Look, the slaves don't care. Notice how you tell them, and they don't care if we're putting fluoride in the water. They don't care if we're injecting them with mercury. They don't deserve to go into the future. And it's a very sick mindset because they take the general public and dumb it down even further. They advertise eugenics as positive eugenics, advancing the elite, and negative eugenics, culling out the inferiors. But in reality, when you read deeper into eugenics, it's really about, as you said, suppressing the best in humanity that isn't evil. They want the best of humanity that is evil, that has their cold-blooded worldview. They're threatened by those on the light side who are intelligent and can go through and defeat all this propaganda mentally and make it through. They want to neutralize and actually dumb down the mass. It is the ultimate crime.
It's a crime, but they also run on these odd theories that become their realities. They force these realities upon the public. And we find out that in the U.S. and in Britain, for instance, and most countries in the West, they implemented a policy from a philosopher, Isaiah Berlin, in Oxford University, who talked about negative freedom and positive freedom. And he said, we're running the world right now on negative freedom, where the people are basically kept dumb, stupid, and happy. But there's very little interference from the state. And when Tony Blair was in, he wrote to this mentor, and he asked, is it possible to combine that type of freedom with positive freedom? Positive freedom is where you get the whole world or all of society working like the Soviets towards some great new dawn, working together. And he wanted to combine the two of them. And he asked this mentor if it was possible to do so. So it's astonishing to realize they dumb us all down. They keep us dumb and stupid. They give us the worst education in a long, long time. And until we have no reasoning abilities for ourselves, They give us all the inoculations, which do affect the brain. I have no doubt about that whatsoever. They target the brain. And then they blame us for being dumb and stupid. This is again a psychopathic outlook on the world. That's how a psychopathic would see it. He blames his victim for the state they're in.
Absolutely. So you have this tiny, maybe 1 out of 500 people that's an actual psychopath, about 1 out of 100 that's a sociopath in the studies, and they create these guilds and then have their own pseudo-humanist religion that rationalizes the horrible things they do. And then for the general public, they tell them they're doing this for their own good, but in private and in their own white papers, they chortle with glee